This yacht cost over $150 million. It has 7 decks, a helipad, and a crew of 40 people working around the clock. It was built for one thing: escape, privacy, freedom, power. The kind of mobility that most people can't even imagine. But here's what happened. This yacht didn't get seized. It didn't get sold at auction. It got held. Not as evidence. Not as punishment. As leverage. Because in the modern world of sanctions enforcement, luxury assets aren't just symbols of wealth anymore. They're pressure points. And this is the story of how a floating palace became collateral in a geopolitical chess game. Let's start with what we're actually talking about here. Superyachts aren't just boats. They're floating nations. The average superyacht costs between $50 million and $300 million. Some go far beyond that. But that's just the purchase price. Annual maintenance runs at about 10% of the yacht's value. Every single year. So if you bought a $100 million yacht, you're spending $10 million annually just to keep it operational. Crew salaries, fuel, insurance, repairs, docking fees, port charges. Monthly operating costs can run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So why do the ultra-wealthy buy them? There are 4 main reasons: privacy, mobility, status, and legal flexibility. A yacht lets you live outside traditional jurisdictions. You can move between international waters, choose where you dock, and operate in a space that's significantly harder for governments to monitor than a fixed residence. It's not a vacation home. It's a mobile sovereign territory. Think about it. When you own a mansion, you're tied to that location and its laws. When you own a yacht, you can literally sail away from problems. You can conduct business in neutral waters. You can host meetings that leave no paper trail. You can live in a way that most regulatory frameworks weren't designed to handle. Now here's where it gets interesting. Almost no billionaire owns a yacht in their own name. Instead, ownership runs through layers. An offshore company, registered in the Cayman Islands or Malta or the Marshall Islands. That company is held by a trust. The trust is managed by a third-party firm. Insurance comes through one country. Crew are hired through another. Maintenance is contracted globally through specialized maritime firms. On paper, this creates distance. The yacht belongs to something like Oceanic Holdings LLC or Mediterranean Ventures SA. Not a person. A corporate shell. And this is completely legal. It's standard tax planning. It's liability protection. It's privacy management. Wealthy families have been structuring assets this way for decades. But here's the problem for enforcement agencies. Legal ownership and beneficial control are 2 very different things. The company might own the yacht on paper. But someone controls that company. Someone decides where the yacht goes, who boards it, how it's used, who benefits from it. And that person, that beneficial owner, that's who authorities actually care about. Because you can hide behind as many shell companies as you want, but if you're the one enjoying the yacht, making the decisions and controlling the asset, then sanctions law treats you as the real owner regardless of what the paperwork says. This particular yacht entered the enforcement radar during a broader review of luxury assets. Not because of one specific incident. Because of a pattern. As global sanctions regimes expanded over the past several years, authorities started looking beyond traditional bank accounts. They began asking a fundamental question. Where else does wealth actually live? The answer was obvious. Physical assets, luxury goods, infrastructure, real estate, private jets, and yachts. Yachts checked every box. They're extremely expensive. They're mobile. They're dependent on international systems. They're maintained through global financial networks. They require constant services from dozens of providers. What caught the attention of authorities wasn't the yacht itself. It was the ecosystem around it. Payments for crew salaries coming from entities that were under sanctions scrutiny. Operational instructions that appeared to originate from outside the listed corporate owner. Docking patterns and travel routes that were similar to other flagged vessels. Management decisions that seemed to involve people who shouldn't have been involved based on the official ownership structure. Financial flows that didn't quite match the story on paper. None of this proved a crime. But it raised questions. Who ultimately benefits from this yacht? Who actually controls it? Who decides where it sails and when? And those questions were enough. Because in sanctions enforcement, you don't need proof beyond reasonable doubt. You need reasonable suspicion of sanctions violations or connections to sanction networks. And this yacht had crossed that threshold. Let's clarify something critical about how sanctions actually work. Sanctions are not criminal charges. They're administrative restrictions. Financial freezes. Travel bans. Asset controls. The purpose isn't punishment in the traditional legal sense. It's behavior modification. It's about limiting the resources and capabilities of targeted individuals or entities. It's about creating costs and consequences for certain actions. You don't need a trial to sanction someone. You don't need a jury. You don't even need to prove guilt in a criminal court. It's a regulatory action, not a criminal prosecution. And that distinction matters enormously because the burden of proof is completely different. The standard of evidence is lower. The procedures are faster. The protections are fewer. Traditional sanctions enforcement used to look like this: freeze bank accounts, block stock trades, restrict corporate entities from doing business. These were financial tools applied to financial systems. If you were sanctioned, your money couldn't move through the banking system. Your investments were locked. Your companies couldn't operate. But modern enforcement looks very different. Authorities realized something important. Money is fluid. It moves. It can be restructured, rerouted, hidden in new accounts under new names. But assets? Physical assets are tangible. They exist in space. They require services. They have dependencies. A yacht needs fuel. It needs insurance. It needs port access. It needs crew agencies. It needs maintenance companies. It needs parts suppliers. Every single one of those is an enforcement point. Every service provider is a potential choke point. So instead of just freezing accounts, enforcement agencies started restricting services. They contacted insurers and told them to drop coverage. They notified port authorities and restricted docking privileges. They pressured fuel suppliers and cut off refueling access. They contacted crew agencies and made it clear that staffing this vessel would be problematic. The message was simple and direct. This vessel is restricted. If you provide services to it, you risk running afoul of sanctions yourself. And that message works because no legitimate company wants to risk their own sanctions exposure for one client. This is where the concept of collateral comes in. In traditional finance, collateral is leverage. You pledge an asset to secure a loan. If you don't pay, the lender takes the collateral. In sanctions enforcement, the concept is similar but reversed. The government doesn't seize the asset outright. They hold it. They restrict it. They control it. They turn it into a bargaining chip. This yacht could still technically float. It was still operational in the basic mechanical sense. But it couldn't dock at major ports anymore. Couldn't access fuel through normal commercial channels. Couldn't hire crew through established agencies. Couldn't maintain insurance through traditional providers. Couldn't get routine maintenance from major maritime firms. It was technically operational but practically trapped. And that's actually more powerful than seizure. Think about it strategically. When you seize an asset, the story ends. You take possession. Eventually you sell it or auction it or liquidate it. It's done. The owner has lost it completely and can move on. But when you hold an asset as collateral, the pressure continues indefinitely. The owner can't use it, can't sell it, can't move it freely. But they're still technically responsible for it, still paying costs where they can, still watching it sit there restricted and isolated, still dealing with the crew situation, the insurance situation, the mounting problems. And that creates sustained pressure. It creates ongoing leverage. It creates a situation where compliance becomes more attractive than continued resistance. Here's what makes this enforcement possible even for a foreign flag vessel registered offshore and operating internationally. United States authorities still had jurisdictional reach. Through dollar-denominated transactions. This is crucial to understand. Almost all major maritime services involve United States dollars at some point in the transaction chain. Insurance policies are underwritten by American firms or reinsured through American companies. Service providers have United States operations or United States banking relationships. Even if a transaction happens between two foreign parties, it often clears through the United States financial system because of the dollar's role as the global reserve currency. That creates what's called the correspondent banking nexus. Additionally, many ports cooperate with American enforcement through bilateral agreements or mutual legal assistance treaties. American-made parts and services are ubiquitous in the maritime industry. GPS systems, communication equipment, safety systems, many of these have American components or require American technical support. So you don't have to be American. You don't have to operate in America. You don't even have to visit American waters. If your yacht touches the dollar system anywhere in its operational chain, if it uses American services or products, if it docks in allied ports, then United States law can reach it. That's the reality of operating in a dollar-based global economy. American financial infrastructure is so deeply embedded in international commerce that avoiding it entirely is nearly impossible for major assets like yachts. It's critical to understand this distinction. No criminal charges were filed in this case. No one was arrested. No trial occurred. No conviction was entered. This was purely regulatory. Administrative action under sanctions law. The standard of evidence is different. The process is different. The outcomes are different. The government doesn't have to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. They have to demonstrate reasonable basis for sanctions designation or asset restriction. They have to show connections, patterns, and control relationships. They have to build an administrative record, not a criminal case. This might seem like a technicality, but it's fundamental to how modern sanctions enforcement works. It's faster, more flexible, and requires less proof than criminal prosecution. But make no mistake, this was strategic. Governments don't hold yachts by accident. They send signals. Seizing a yacht makes headlines for one news cycle. The yacht is grabbed, maybe auctioned, and then the story fades. But holding a yacht creates sustained pressure over months or years. It tells other yacht owners that this could happen to them too. It tells service providers that compliance with sanctions matters more than any single client. It tells the global elite that luxury is no longer insulation from government reach. It's actually exposure. Because the more expensive and visible your assets are, the more leverage they provide to authorities. This case didn't just affect one yacht. It triggered a wave of reassessment across elite wealth management networks worldwide. Wealth managers started reviewing client asset structures. They began asking harder questions about beneficial ownership and control. They reassessed their own exposure to sanctions risk. Yacht owners began moving assets, changing registrations, restructuring ownership through different jurisdictions. Some started divesting from yachts entirely, seeing them as too visible and too vulnerable. Others doubled down on opacity, adding more layers and more complexity to their structures. But governments adapted too. Every new privacy strategy was met with updated enforcement techniques. Every new offshore structure was met with enhanced scrutiny. It became an arms race between opacity and transparency, between privacy and accountability. Yachts, private jets, waterfront estates, these assets used to represent escape. They represented distance from oversight and freedom from normal constraints. They were the ultimate symbols of wealth that could move, that could stay ahead of problems, that could operate in the gaps between jurisdictions. Now they're treated as enforcement levers. They're seen as physical manifestations of wealth that can be monitored through satellite tracking, that can be restricted through service denial, that can be controlled through international cooperation. Ownership no longer guarantees protection. Distance no longer means safety. Mobility no longer means freedom. In fact, the very features that made these assets attractive, their visibility, their need for services, their movement through monitored spaces, these have become vulnerabilities in the age of modern sanctions enforcement. Think about it strategically from the government's perspective. When you seize an asset completely, the story ends. You take possession. You eventually sell it or liquidate it or transfer it. It's done and finished. The owner has lost it completely and can move on psychologically and financially. But when you hold an asset as collateral, when you restrict it without fully seizing it, the pressure continues indefinitely. The owner can't use the asset for its intended purpose. Can't sell it to recover value. Can't move it freely to safer jurisdictions. Can't enjoy it or benefit from it. But they're still technically the owner. Still nominally responsible for it where local law applies. Still paying whatever ongoing costs they can manage. Still watching it sit there in some restricted port or anchorage, deteriorating slowly, representing millions of dollars of trapped wealth. Still dealing with crew issues as people quit or need to be paid off. Still dealing with insurance lapses and maintenance backlogs and mounting problems. And that creates tremendous leverage for negotiation, for compliance, for behavior modification, which is what sanctions are actually designed to accomplish. The goal isn't really to punish. The goal is to create costs and consequences that change behavior. To make sanctioned activity so expensive and difficult that targets choose to comply. To make luxury lifestyle maintenance impossible without addressing the underlying sanctions issues. Holding assets as collateral achieves this better than outright seizure because the pressure never fully resolves. It just continues, accumulating costs and frustration and leverage. So what happens to this yacht? What's the ultimate outcome? There are several possibilities, and the truth is we don't know yet because these situations can take years to resolve. One possibility is continued restrictions until policy changes. The yacht remains in legal limbo, restricted but not seized, for an extended period. Another possibility is transfer to government control if compliance isn't achieved. If sanctions violations are formally established or if the asset is ultimately forfeited through legal proceedings, the government takes possession. Then there's eventual auction under forfeiture proceedings, where the yacht is sold and the proceeds potentially go to government funds or victim compensation. Or there's release under strict conditions and ongoing monitoring, where the yacht is allowed to operate again but under heavy scrutiny and with significant restrictions on its use and movement. The outcome depends on factors far beyond the yacht itself. Geopolitical relations between countries involved. Diplomatic negotiations at high levels. Compliance with broader sanctions regimes. Changes in political leadership or policy priorities. International cooperation on enforcement. The yacht is just one piece, one asset, one pressure point in a much larger game of international relations and sanctions policy. Its fate will be determined by considerations that have nothing to do with the vessel itself and everything to do with the broader strategic landscape. But zoom out for a moment from this specific case. This was never really about just one yacht. It was about power. It was about demonstrating that wealth, no matter how mobile, no matter how carefully structured, can still be reached by determined governments. It was about showing that luxury assets aren't privileges anymore in the traditional sense. They're vulnerabilities. They're dependencies. They're points of leverage. This case sent a message to wealthy elites globally: your lifestyle requires infrastructure, and infrastructure can be denied. Your mobility requires services, and services can be cut off. Your privacy requires cooperation, and cooperation can be withdrawn. The walls between jurisdictions that once protected extreme wealth are increasingly porous in an age of international sanctions cooperation. This vessel was built for escape, for freedom, for the kind of distance that money can buy, for the ability to live outside normal rules and normal constraints. It represented the ultimate aspiration of extreme wealth, the ability to be truly independent, truly mobile, truly beyond reach. But distance doesn't matter anymore. Geography doesn't protect you when financial systems are global and enforcement is coordinated. Flags of convenience don't shield you when every port and every service provider is part of the same international network. Shell companies don't hide you when beneficial ownership investigations can pierce through layers of corporate structures. When luxury becomes evidence, when assets become leverage, when mobility becomes a liability, when the very things that were supposed to represent freedom become chains, everything changes. The yacht stops being a privilege and becomes collateral. And that transformation from symbol of ultimate freedom to tool of enforcement pressure represents a fundamental shift in how power operates in the modern world. Wealth can still buy many things, but it cannot buy true independence from the global systems that make luxury lifestyle possible. And when those systems are turned against you, when that infrastructure is denied, your $150 million yacht becomes nothing more than a very expensive prison, floating in international waters with nowhere to go and no way to operate. That's the new reality of luxury assets in the age of global sanctions enforcement.